So basically on May 12th, I think it was, the vote to close debate failed. And, usually that will be the end of a bill in the Senate because you're not usually going to change a lot of minds. And it wasn't very close. I think they only got 48, votes in favor of it. So they were far away from the 60 that they needed. Then in a week's time frame, they really were hammering through negotiations. A number of amendments were made to the bill. And basically what they did was the amendments limited the abilities of tech companies to issue stablecoins. I think there was some concern like, Google could issue a stablecoin. And so there's a prohibition there. Also, the bill specifically applies ethics standards to people like Elon Musk and David Sachs, who are, pretty prominent in the government right now. Essentially, there's a prohibition on current members of Congress and senior members of the executive branch in issuing stablecoins while they're serving the public. One of the fears they probably had is that maybe Trump, after this legislation passes, turns around and issues a stablecoin. Not that I don't, think that was necessarily likely, but they wanted to be sure that I think the Democrats wanted to be sure that they wouldn't be burned in like passing legislation only to later be seen as like maybe enabling, the issuance of stablecoins, like, and not having done anything about it. So some of the amendments are directed towards making sure that members of government and their families, by the way, also included, cannot issue stablecoins. So I think once they worked through those amendments, that probably made people on both sides of the aisle, certainly the Democrats, more receptive to passing the legislation. And then after those amendments were implemented and are part of the bill, they re-voted on this, this cloitre vote, which is the closure of debate. And it passed on a 66-32 vote. So you actually had 16 Democrats join 50 Republicans in passing the legislation. So, in today's day and age, like that's not bad. Like that's pretty good as far as getting something, bipartisan.
And then what about, I guess, we just talked about the Senate procedures, but there's also the House. So if the House does approve the Senate's version, what would happen as the next steps and thereafter?
Yeah, I mean, importantly, like it's not actually passed the Senate yet. All we've done so far is close the debate on it. So now they'll actually have to vote on it again. But the next time they only need 50 votes. So there's other changes that might still be made to the legislation in between. There might be additional negotiations. They might be thinking about like what the House will have. But yeah, basically like the Senate's going to vote to pass the legislation at some point, presumably. And then, the House can, either take direction from the Senate. They can either pass the Senate's bill, whatever, if they pass the exact bill that's in the Senate, then it would go to the president for signature and presumably be signed. Or they could pass their own version of the legislation. And it is a bit easier to pass things in the House in the US because you only need a majority. So, the Republicans have control of the House. They don't need any Democrat votes. If they can keep everyone from their party, they could actually pass the legislation like as they, without negotiating. But so if they pass a different version, then eventually the House and Senate versions would have to be merged into one bill, and they'd both have to vote again unless either chamber like passes the other one's version. Usually they'll negotiate. They'll have they'll appoint negotiators for each chamber, and then they'll come up with a final draft of the bill, and then everybody, they vote again, and if that passes, it goes to the president. So we're still a few steps away, but I think that shouldn't take away from the fact that like this step that we just got passed is probably the most difficult one. So it's really boding well for the ultimate passage of stablecoin legislation.
Yeah, now that we've got the process done, I think maybe we should focus a bit on the implications and like why it matters a bit. So yeah. I think I understand that it is bipartisan and there is some sort of provision associated with, having to hold U.S. treasuries against the reserves. But why does the U.S. government care? And let me pause.
Yeah. So, I mean, just thinking about why this is important, again, I think it will bring into the, regulatory permissive space, like everyone that's issuing stablecoins it'll bring in institutional players, like maybe they have reluctance on using stable coins still. That should all go away. I think that will really help. Big companies might start to be more comfortable using stable coins for cross-border payments and things like that. It should really just like put stablecoin usage on steroids, really. And really from the government standpoint, like this is only a good thing because it's, it helps preserve, US dollar dominance. These coins that would be, realize these licenses under the bill, they would all be backed by US dollars. So, and denominated in US dollars. So, that only would increase the, dominance, hegemony of the US dollar, which is that's something that's beneficial for the government. In addition, for every stable coin that's issued, the person's either going to go hold cash, the entity's either going to hold cash, but more likely they're going to buy US treasuries for most of it because they want to earn yield. And, buying US treasuries is going to help support, debt issuance of the government. So this, for what it's worth, like should be the easy thing. It's not even necessarily like because it's crypto. This is just like a positive for the government. There's a pretty major incentive, direct incentive for them to get this done, which is, maybe a good and bad indicator. Like it's good that this is moving forward, but also perhaps troubling that even this has been a little bit difficult to, get across the finish line. I think it is taking a bit longer than some people might have hoped. Here we are, it's, 4 months into the administration. We're still not at the finish line. Like it could be several more months. And when you think about like the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is much less straightforward, the crypto market structure, I think, where there maybe had been high hopes of getting that done, by this summer, I think now most people are just hoping they can get it done like in this Congress before, the elections maybe come in 2026. But, we mentioned yield before, and I think that's a good topic for discussion with the stablecoin legislation, because one of the, in both the House and the Senate versions, one pretty important aspect, I think, of it for stablecoin holders is that the entities that issue stablecoins are not allowed to pay the holders of stablecoins any yields or interest. So they'll earn interest on buying US treasuries, perhaps, but they cannot pay that to the holders. There's a prohibition in the bill. And I think it's, there's two sides to that coin, but for, I think, people in the crypto space, it's a relatively, controversial position. I know I've written in the past that I feel pretty strongly that it would be beneficial for, the holders to be able to be paid interest. I think it's the most fair system, but that doesn't appear, at least right now, that doesn't appear to be what we're going to get.
It's just interesting that, you talked about aligned interest with the US government. And I think in recent months, China had released the digital yuan, and US reserve currency status has been an ongoing topic given relationships between, China's rise in the last couple of decades. So I guess if it does make so much sense for the US, I guess maybe let's talk about the flip side, why there was so much resistance to it in the past. And, maybe what's the downside of having US stablecoins released more?
Yeah, I mean, I think just some legislators are just hesitant to approve anything in the crypto space. They haven't maybe wrapped their minds around the fact that, this is not going away. This is now a big space. Like over the, back when I first got into the space, there were no institutional players in the space. And maybe then you might have been able to think to yourself, like, maybe this will go away. It'll never be legitimized. But I think that ship has long ago sailed. I mean, especially, when you have the, Bitcoin ETFs that were approved last year and, funds like BlackRock launching ETFs, like the institutions are already here. And this is really just maybe the next step after, ETFs. Stable coins is maybe the most obvious, easy thing. But yeah, there's resistance because in some people's minds, this is maybe just something that's used for crime, right? To some people. But, I think those of us that are in the crypto space, we know better. Like, one of the things that gets lost in the US, I think a lot, is that, if you're living in the US, you mostly have access to like a stable currency and a bank account, but that's not the case in a lot of the world. There's a lot of places in the world where their currency is very inflationary, or the banking system, you can't maybe be certain that you're going to be able to withdraw your funds from a bank in the future. And, having stable coins solves a lot of those problems. It also solves problems for people that are in the US that are, need to send money to other parts of the world, whether they have family there or, just part of business. We're still operating in the US under a banking system and wire transfers that were, are from like the 1970s, the SWIFT banking system. So this is a major upgrade to that, but there's always going to be resistance to change. I think that though that most people, as we're seeing with the bipartisan nature of this legislation, do see the benefits. It's just, nothing's ever easy in government, right? That's just, you never want to see the sausage being made in government. And that's kind of why it's just like any legislation's difficult, and this has been no exception.
Yeah, I think the major things to track is maybe security and then chain analysis, for example, being integrated. There's travel rule. There's also, if you have proper KYC requirements at each centralized exchanges for off-ramping, at least you could track the flow of money to see any sort of tax avoidance. So when you think of, the couple of topics that come to mind is, there's like the FinCEN rule for $10,000 that they like to sort of track. You couple that with just ensuring you're tracking taxes properly. Theoretically, if you could solve all those things, it makes it possible to, have a lot more US stablecoins released, right? Is that the missing piece that the government's sort of waiting for?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is some reluctance there. But again, I think that's just a lack of understanding of crypto. If you were going to commit a crime, like using crypto to do it is not really the best avenue, like of all the things you can do. Yes, transactions can happen quickly. That's maybe one disadvantage from the government standpoint, like that they can't like stop a wire transfer, because it takes 7 days to clear. They don't have as much time to examine it and maybe stop the process of it. But at the same time, like crypto, you could see transactions and they're there forever. So it's not really the best way to move funds around and launder money if you're in the criminal space. I heard somebody say this great quote the other day, so I'm gonna steal it, but it's, if cash were a thing that were invented today, the government would never allow it, right? And essentially that's because like it's so much easier to commit crimes with cash. There's zero tracking, once you withdraw it from the bank or once cash is issued, it's like almost impossible to control and track for the government. So, this is certainly not the worst method of control that the government has. But I think like with blockchain, just, being able to see the transactions, I don't think necessarily like it's really that conducive to crime compared to some other avenues.
Okay. No, that totally makes sense. Is there anything else we should touch upon within stablecoins, or is that it before we move to market structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to, we're all waiting to see what will happen. And hopefully in the next couple of months, we're talking about, getting this done and moving on to the market structure, more focus on the market structure legislation, which is really like the big important thing in crypto that everybody is wants to focus on.
Okay. So I guess when we think about market structure, it seems like, there's been a discussion draft that was released in May. There were over 200 pages in depth, and it refers to a bunch of things. I don't know if people have actually dove into it. I think you might have spent the time to do that. So
I mean, I'm one of the lawyers that went through it so that other people don't have to, right? It's 200 pages of legislation. As you mentioned, it came out May 5th. This is only a draft. So there's going to be a million things that could change between now. No votes have happened. We were talking about the stablecoin process. This has not passed any committees, hasn't come up for any votes, at least this version of the bill. Like I do think it's maybe pertinent to think back last year, the FIT 21 legislation was a little bit similar. Actually, there's a lot of similarities, and we can discuss some of the differences in it, a little bit later. But, that actually did pass the US House. I think it was last May, so pretty much a year ago. And that was under, of course, we had the House was controlled by Republicans just like it is today, but it was passed in a very bipartisan manner. So hopefully, I think many people are hoping that this will too. But at least this version, like, it was just released. There's been no votes taken. So we kind of have a clean slate here. And everybody's, since the release on May 5th has been, diving in to see what's in it.
Okay. So what specifically does it refer to? Like how like a project issues the token, the fundraising conduction, what counts as security? I remember back in the day, we'd always talk about the Howey test. It just doesn't seem to count as much, and then maybe how it applies to exchanges or brokers. I think, are those the main topics to focus on?
I mean, I think you're hitting on it, is that there's a lot in there. It covers a broad, when we say market structure, it's like applying to a lot of different parts of the crypto, regulatory system, and thinking about who regulates it is a pretty big, point of this legislation, because that's something that's been unclear, whether, it should be the SEC or the CFTC, or, the Justice Department has been involved in certain legal actions. So, I think what may be one of the most important things, though, is to discuss like why this is so important. So it covers a lot of things, but it's super important because, right now, maybe everybody's resting a little bit easier in the crypto space because they're not as worried about, there being an enforcement action. The agencies of the government have essentially come out and said, we're not going to worry about enforcing on crypto unless there's fraud. I mean, don't commit fraud. They've said that repeatedly, and they will come after you if you are a person that's doing that. But if, you are trying to do the right thing, at least right now, because there's essentially no rules in place, you probably shouldn't expect to be receiving an enforcement action from, the SEC or the CFTC. But, as we all know, governments change, and there's going to be a new administration in, 3+ years. And who knows, like, whether they'll be as friendly to the crypto space. So, let's say they're unfriendly. Could things just go back to the way they were? Could we be looking at like Gensler 2 and things go back to the way they were there? And, that could be a major concern, because what people really need, especially if you're going to be an institution in the crypto space, like, you want some certainty. You don't want to be like following what you think is the rule now, only for later some other government body to say this isn't the rule. And we talked a bit, with stablecoin legislation, maybe is a good example of how difficult legislation is to pass. But the really good part about that is once you do get something passed, it's also really hard to change. So, if we're able to pass, market structure legislation in this Congress and have it enacted into law, then it will be very difficult, even if there's a hostile administration to crypto at some point in the future, they won't be able to, really reverse the legislation. An executive order from or the agencies are supposed to act within the bounds of the legislation. And if they don't, you could fight that in court, and you'd be able to say, oh, well, the legislation says, X, and they're doing Y. So they shouldn't be allowed to do that. And you should win that case. So, getting legislation passed, very important. And I mean, it is comprehensive. So that's a good thing. And there's a lot of different particulars in there. You started talking about like fundraisers. And for me, like, I focus mostly on, projects launching tokens and selling tokens, because that's mostly where I've done a lot of my legal counseling in the space. And, I have to say, like, in general, there would be a pretty huge improvement there, is probably, one of the main areas where you'd really get, a good amount of clarity. And it's essentially, if we just focus on, token issuance by an entity, there would be a safe harbor provision where a project would essentially be able to raise funds for itself by selling either tokens or the rights to tokens. And there would be a 4-year grace period where, if a project intends to decentralize, they could fall under this safe harbor, and then they'd have 4 years to actually do it. And they'd be able to, there's the limits in the legislation. The draft legislation are that, that project would be able to raise up to $150 million per year. So, that's, while there's definitely a few projects that have exceeded that threshold, the vast majority of founding teams are going to be, that's going to be more than sufficient for what they would need to raise. But, basically they just have to disclose certain information in order to fall under that safe harbor, which is, it's not all, defined in this legislation, and I'm sure even what's there could change, but essentially like a lot of the things that people are already disclosing to maybe venture capital entities when they're looking to invest anyway, a lot of the due diligence that they're running is the same stuff that you'd have to disclose, like when you're doing a sale of either tokens or future tokens to fall under this exemption. So I think that's a pretty positive thing. It's definitely something people have been looking for, maybe begging for, right? Like to say, just tell us what we need to disclose. And then if we can fall under the regulations, like we're happy to comply. I think that really accounts for a very large percentage of, founding teams.
Yeah, I think when we think of IPOs, there are like road shows and there's like specific periods that people can release information, specific people they can talk to at a certain time, like press release paths that they have to go through specifically. I think, because the exchanges themselves, like Coinbase and Kraken, aren't as heavily regulated, it's hard to control that standardization of that process. Is there, I think first part of that question is there more, is there any clear guidance given some of the readings from this report? And then secondly, maybe we could talk a bit about, you had touched upon the separate jurisdictions between the SEC and the CFTC, one being a bit more focused on primary markets and the second being more secondary, but, understanding a bit of the differences there, because I think we do see a lot of CFTC, SEC fighting in the headlines, and it's kind of hard to sort of decide what the differences are between the two of them sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you think about like the IPO process, and there's a number of different steps to it, but it takes a really long time for a company to go public. And the other thing is it's very expensive. Like filing an S1 statement and getting it prepared and doing all the things that you mentioned, like in a compliant way, and just setting up the company structure to go public. It's a pretty enormous undertaking that you can't really do when you're, just starting out. I mean, people were doing, I guess, you had this whole like SPAC, this sort of wave of SPACs, a couple of years back, but that's basically ended. So, there's not really a great way for, an early on tech startup to go public, because they don't have the funds to do it. They have to first raise the funds, get some revenue, and then maybe several years down the line, they're going public. So that's not really a viable way, not a really a viable path for the, crypto companies to, basically raise funds. What people have been doing is following, it's perfectly legal for tech startups that are private to raise funds. There are exemptions to, SEC registration requirements. You essentially can, sell, use convertible notes. It's a pretty well-known process that, companies will use, like convertible notes. And so you're basically promising someone that they're going to get shares of the company in the future if they, invest in your project. And then, when you actually do issue shares to the investors, they're going to be on the list to get them. And that's perfectly legal so long as you follow accredited investor rules or, sell outside the US. There's a very defined process there. Why that doesn't necessarily work for crypto companies, so crypto companies are using that process, but why it doesn't necessarily work is because people are not really interested in shares of a crypto project, because that's not where the value, most people don't see that as where the value is going to come in the future. Where they see the value is going to be the tokens. And in my experience, a lot of times the investors just don't even really care about shares. Maybe they have more so in recent years, but it used to be that they didn't care anything at all about them. And that's just like a side benefit. Like the main thing they're after is getting the tokens. So the way that that's been happening is through usually token warrants, which then you would set up a complicated structure with an offshore entities. Everybody's familiar with these foundations that would be formed, and you'd set up like, a separate entity that's going to issue the tokens, because you can't be doing that out of the US. But what this legislation will do is basically change that and say, what they're aiming to do is to change it and say, well, you can do this in the US, because now if you give this, set of information and you stay under the $150 million limits and follow, whatever other steps are in place, which are presumably going to be, reasonable to follow, then you can sell your tokens or your future tokens right out of your US entity. And then you don't have to play this game of setting up a foreign structure and, pretending like everybody has really wanted to purchase shares, even though, what they were really after is tokens. So it's a pretty drastic change. I think it'll definitely be helpful for most projects. Like they'll get more certainty of, not having to worry about like, is this foreign, structure, interplay between the foundation and the US labs company, is that going to get challenged or just blow up? Like, because I didn't, follow the necessary separation between the entities. I think it's, definitely getting some certainty there would be very helpful for many projects. And, while we do have a lot of investment already in the space, it'll probably encourage a lot more. Maybe some, tech VCs that are reluctant to get into crypto will say, oh, okay, now that this is legal, like let me see where I can best invest. And you really could see a lot of benefits there.
I think that covers the first part of the question. I'm not even remembering my second part of the question, which was, is there anything else for market structure? Or I think we covered most of the points.
Yeah, I think, there's just some other things to think about, right? Like, so I mentioned that, one of the things that has been, a source of uncertainty has been what regulator is in charge of crypto. And of course, like famously, like Gensler thought the SEC should be involved in everything, like every part of the space, whereas like the CFTC would have a smaller role. But this legislation does seek to define the roles of the agencies. So essentially, what's going to happen if this draft bill were to become law would be that the SEC would play, a role in, this safe harbor period that I was mentioning, where you can raise the 150 million per year and you have to disclose certain information. And then, you're hoping to move towards decentralization. But once you get past that point and you've issued your token and you're, sufficiently decentralized, then the CFTC would be the main regulator for the space, which is it's not only different for the space, but it's also a new role for the CFTC. It would be regulating spot markets in crypto, and it doesn't regulate any other spot markets. So it's really, the F in CFTC is for futures, and that's more what its focus is. So it's an interesting role change for the CFTC. But, I think, to me, at least, having whatever agency is going to take it up, I think it's just important that we just have one source. We don't have, conflicting viewpoints, and, you get into territorial competitions between like the chairs of the agencies. It's good to just like, let's get it resolved. Whatever agency it is infinitely better than not having it resolved. So
I know in the SEC, there's 5 commissioners. And then in the past, in the old regime, 3 of them were, anti-crypto. Now it seems like 3 are crypto friendly. In the CFTC, is there a similar setup where there might be a risk that you might have like a non-crypto friendly, folks come in? Or I don't know if there's like multiple people in the commission.
Yeah, it kind of functions a lot the same way. It's also 5 commissioners. They are appointed the same way in the sense that they're chosen by the president. They have to be confirmed by the Senate. And one of the 5 commissioners is the chairman. So, Gensler for the SEC has been one of the 5 SEC commissioners. And essentially, he had 2 others that were, agreeing with him on his outlook and enforcement in the crypto space for the past 4 years. So he was able to do kind of, basically enact his agenda there. The CFTC functions pretty much the same way. Again, 5 commissioners. And, as long as you get 3 of them, which, the president, that's one of the benefits of being president, is getting to appoint the people in these agencies. But, I think that's just even emphasizing, right, like why legislation as opposed to just relying on, executive orders or rulemaking from the agencies is so much, legislation is just so much better, because like whatever the commissioners are, they have to follow the law. If they don't follow the law, then if they enforce something against you, then you would take them to court, and you should be able to win, referring to the legislation and saying, okay, Your Honor, they're not following it. So, we got to get this legislation passed, whatever the regulatory authorities are. In most instances, I think a lot of instances in government, it doesn't matter so much who are the regulators. It has, been so prominent in crypto just because like there's no defined role for the agencies. So they have a lot of power and a lot of leeway to, take the initiatives that they want, take the approach that they want. So yeah, if we get some legislation that makes sense, that will be, at least like put some boundaries on whoever the commissioners are, like what they can do.
So in the past, a lot of projects still have to get legal opinions mandated from exchanges. And you often see things like, entity structures that are offshore. And this can range anywhere from Cayman, BVI. You see some Switzerland entities, Singapore. Would market structure change any of, either legal opinions or entity setups for projects moving forward? Or is that probably still just going to be consistent and you just have clear guidelines around it?
No, you probably, if the exchange process stays similar, right? Like they're probably still going to want opinions. It's just that the opinions should get a lot simpler, really. Instead of now doing this, fancy Howey test and analyzing every, SEC enforcement action that's taken place and why, a project is different than the enforcement that has been taking place in those instances. And an ever-changing and evolving body of law, if we get some legislation, it should simplify things. And then you just focus on, ideally, we would just focus on like, well, if you did the things that you're supposed to do according to the legislation and whatever rules are, put forth by the SEC in the rulemaking that helps define the legislation, clarify it, then, there shouldn't be a problem with exchanges. So I would think it should be simpler, which again, that should be good for everyone.
Okay, that's good to hear. I guess just maybe if we are good to transition to the SEC update and, the shifting enforcement landscape, I think you've seen the SEC drop several high profile cases. For example, there were some prior lawsuits against Kraken, Coin, and Consensus, and specifically noting the processes they've taken or like the tokens that they've decided to list. There's been a pullback from those enforcement actions, but like how can we think about that in terms of, is this temporary in nature? What are things that people can government get in this process? How do projects rethink about it? It just in general from multiple stakeholders, how do we think about the shifting SEC landscape at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's been pretty much a 180-degree shift from where we were before. And it's not just the SEC, it's across government. You had the Department of Justice releasing a memo, I think back in March, stating that they're no longer going to pursue crypto enforcement, except if it's like a case of fraud. They're not going to be like tacking themselves on to any more enforcement actions. You've had the SEC, drop those cases that you mentioned. You've also had, the SEC drop the case against Ripple recently, or, it's not actually dismissed yet just because of some procedural issues, but they have reached an agreement with Ripple, and that case will be, once they get that procedural stuff sorted out, that will be going away soon too. So, pretty much every prominent enforcement action in the space has, they basically have, dismissed or reached an agreement with the parties that were, that they were pursuing. So, I think like that's pretty positive for the space. I don't know that people have necessarily focused on that enough. One of the things that, because Gensler was so aggressive with the SEC, I can remember back when the lawsuit was filed against Ripple. So this was in late 2020. Like it was really like about the worst thing in the world for them to have like a lawsuit from the SEC against them. Later, fast forward a couple of years to when Coinbase and others were sued, they immediately pushed back against the SEC and said, they're wrong. We're going to fight this. And I think, it wasn't viewed quite as negatively. So maybe that's possibly why people aren't necessarily seeing this as positive of a change as it really is. But yeah, I mean, right now, I wouldn't say there's free reign, but it's like you have a very receptive group of regulators in the government. We recently had an SEC chair confirmed, Paul Atkins, who has, I think, been fighting on the side of crypto projects for, many years. And he's a former SEC commissioner himself. So really should be equipped to, direct the agency. He knows, how it works. He knows what's been happening in some of the enforcement actions, in the crypto space. And, his public statements and his actions in the past are very much, supportive of the industry. Again, like, Nobody's saying like that there should be rug pulls or crime in the space, but what they want is like for the good actors to, be able to function. I've heard, Hester Peirce has been on a number of roundtables, basically like a listening tour. They're trying to hear what the concerns of, the industry are, of founders and other players in the industry, so that I think, they say they're going to put forward some rules. Another thing that was like completely lacking under the last, administration was there were no, they never went through the formal rulemaking process in the SEC or the CFTC or anywhere. The rules were really just basically whatever the most recent enforcement actions were, and you never could tell. And projects did try to, Coinbase famously went to the SEC, tried to, get an opinion from them and try to, follow within the parameters that the SEC wanted. And not only did the SEC not really like give them any direction, they turned around and sued them based on those conversations. So it was like pretty much like the worst type of dialogue and relationship imaginable. And now that's kind of flipped on its head, because they are, they're out there, they're trying to listen. They want to hear what the concerns are. And I think, they say they're going to put forward rules that make sense. And from everything that they've said, they appear a lot in public making statements and just on these roundtables and things. Like, it seems like they're serious. So we'll see, what the rules will say. But so far, the actions of dismissing the, whatever enforcement that was going on before, major positive.
You'd mentioned the Ripple case in the past where they, I think they agreed to pay $50 million. And this was related to the $1.3 billion unregistered security sale of XRP back in 2020. I think this is a positive settlement number. Maybe is it a positive settlement number? I guess it could have been much higher. Like, what makes it good?
Yeah, I mean, I think that case is a little bit different than some of the others because it actually went through summary judgment. So you had like all this discovery, you had the completion, the way litigation goes, right, is first, there's a complaint filed, which the SEC did. And then after that, parties might move to dismiss the complaint, which is what happened there. Assuming the case moves forward, then you go through like the discovery process. And at the end of that, parties can move for summary judgment. And that's what happened there. The SEC and Ripple both cross moved for summary judgment. And, there was a summary judgment ruling that was actually issued. So you had a final judgment from the lower court in the Ripple case. And, if you look at it, the SEC won some things, but lost most of it. Basically, the programmatic sales, what they called the programmatic sales in the case, the court ruled that those were not the unregistered sale of securities, basically being like, if somebody went and bought Ripple, XRP from an exchange, that would not qualify because they didn't have a contract with the issuer of the token. So, that excluded most of the sales that the SEC was after. Now, there was a smaller segment of sales that they were allowed to, basically that the court awarded the SEC judgment on. And, so that was basically what was left. Now, both sides appealed and the case was pending on appeal. So, which is one of the reasons why, I think it hasn't been dismissed yet. The SEC and Ripple went to the district court to try to dismiss it. And the district court, basically said that it does not have jurisdiction to dismiss the case. But yeah, I mean, I think the $50 million settlement, considering what the SEC was after in the case, if that had been offered early on, Ripple probably would have taken it.
Okay, that's good to hear. And then, I mean, since then, Ripple has gone on to make a couple, they acquired Hidden Road recently, which is a prime brokerage firm that's being known for its quite developed tech stack. And they've been in the limelight for its pursuit of Circle alongside Coinbase. How should we, obviously those are positives. So Ripple's getting more involved after a bit of this SEC stuff. Is there anything else we should consider alongside those actual potential or actual acquisitions?
Yeah, I think there's other things that have been happening. I think from a positive standpoint in the regulatory space, everybody remembers like Tornado Cash, right? And essentially the government sought to sanction the actual code of Tornado Cash. In addition to, they also brought actions against the people that were involved with the project. And so, that is something else that went through judicial system to some extent, but basically like whatever the procedural posture is, it's a little bit convoluted. But where we left off there is that the Tornado Cash code was removed from the sanctions list. Now, the government did that voluntarily, and there's still parties that are pushing for a court ruling to make sure that they couldn't bring it back. So that's kind of the rest of it that still needs to play out. But at least like for right now, again, like thinking about positive developments in the space, that's yet another thing. It's like, something that seemed to people in the space that made no sense before. Like, why would you can't sanction computer code? It's like sanctioning the internet for, bad actors like that send like spam emails or something. Makes, it's casting too broad of a brush. It really didn't make sense. And, that's just yet another thing that's good to see dropped. But yeah, like, you saw like many, with the Ripple acquisition, you see a lot of these projects, like they're sitting on a bunch of cash. And as the space clears, we get some regulatory clarity, or at least in the near term, we're getting less enforcement. It can pave the way for them to, maybe make some acquisitions, or, maybe launch some things that they might have been more reluctant to do in the past. And especially to make them available to US customers, which is, something that's a constant thought in the crypto space, that we are like, okay, we're launching something. Can we, make it available to US, users, or do we have to limit the US in some way, either by like, VPN blocking, or just, making rules against the US, or doing IP address blocking? That's a constant analysis that goes into a lot of different aspects of the crypto space. So it's good to see some of this starting to clear up. But again, I think whatever the positives are in the SEC, like most of this, you need either at least rulemaking, if not legislation, to really get a true resolution.
Yeah, it's good to see a lot of these positive developments in the right way. On that sort of note, I mean, we did touch upon Paul Atkins, and we knew that he served as commissioner from 2002 to 2008. And in the interim period, I think he's been, leading his own sort of practice. But was the swearing in of Paul Atkins like a positive thing, and was that the best possible outcome? I wasn't tracking like the potential other candidates for example.
Yeah, I mean, so I think people started throwing out names shortly after the election in November. When he got, I guess, tapped to lead the SEC, the reaction was almost universally positive, just based on his background. Again, I think apart, maybe different from some of the other people that were being considered, like having previous SEC experience is really helpful, in addition to having a viewpoint that is certainly much more favorable than what we were dealing with Gary Gensler. So knowing how the agency works, like there's a lot of people there and a lot of different attorneys doing a lot of different enforcement. I mean, crypto is honestly, it's not even a big, they do a lot of different things, and crypto is a small aspect of it. So, but just having somebody that, knew how it worked. The other thing was, I mean, from the standpoint of why Paul Atkins is such a positive, two of the current commissioners actually were his staffers when he was a commissioner back in the early 2000s. So, I think, being able to work well with them is just another, yet another positive, because again, like this is a 5-member commission, and you need to, just because you're the chair, you don't get to just do whatever you want. There are votes taken. So having a good working relationship already with 2 of the commissioners is a major positive as well.
It's like you have a mini team within the 5 of them that have worked together.
Yeah.
Quite funny. Okay. I think we've kind of beat that quite significantly, the SEC point. I think that the final point that we wanted to get to today is maybe just talking about recent news. So Coinbase's data breach and what that sort of means for KYC and in general. But you want to maybe level set us with what exactly happened, and that there's a certain amount that was at risk, and
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so, I guess the first thing to think about is that Coinbase collects data from its users. Like if you go to open an account on Coinbase, they run KYC, which they're required to do by the government. And the legal reason for that, for them is maybe even more for some other than for some other entities, because they're a licensed money transmitter. So they have certain duties, and so they must run, KYC, and they do so on their users. So if you go to open an account on Coinbase, you can expect that you're going to be giving them your social security number. You're going to be giving them your address. Like, they may take copies of your identification. Obviously you cannot be like a non-user, like you're going to be giving them your full legal name. So they are going to have like some valuable information about each one of their users. Now, they also have a customer service department, because many times people have to call in or, contact the customer service because they are looking to do something on the platform and they have questions or whatever, their account gets frozen or certain things happen and they need to contact customer service. So those people that are in the customer service group need to have access to the personal information. They need to know who they're talking to and to verify that. So, unfortunately, like with that access, it's also pretty risky. And I think that's what happened here. There were some, a group of people that were in customer service and they were overseas, and, some bad actor came in, and it sounds like they, bribed one or more of these people, and then they gave access to this bad actor to personal information. I think it was of like 70,000 Coinbase users. And, when they get the personal information, they had a lot, they're getting social security numbers, they're getting bank account numbers, they could be getting credit card numbers. Like, they're getting a lot of different things that are very dangerous to those 70,000 people. So, Coinbase actually only, they've discovered this, it sounds like, when the person that took this data demanded a $20 million ransom to, not release it to the public or not, use it, I guess, essentially. Now, Coinbase didn't pay that ransom, but, being a public company, they did disclose to their, their investors. They filed a statement with the SEC, which anyone can look at, but they are estimating that the damage to them could be up to 400 million in remediation costs. And I don't even think that necessarily counts like reputational damage. That's just like the cost that they expect to pay to fix this. Like, because people could sue them, they're going to have to obviously examine all their data policies and make a number of changes and implement more security and just reconsider everything. But yeah, they're expecting, I think the range was like between around 200 million to 400 million. That's not a small chunk of change, but yeah, not a good situation. I mean, and I think, I've been seeing stories on, crypto Twitter, just of people that have had their data stolen by, so it is, already affecting people. It's just,
this seems like it might be a pretty big event, but I mean, despite that, Coinbase's stock seems to drop on that day, but it's recovered.
Yeah, aside
from value, are there any other legal and regulatory implications we should consider that, knock-on effects from basically this one incident?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's important for everybody that takes personal information of users to consider how it's stored and who's got access to it. I mean, that's something that they are, data people are always talking about. But this just, maybe just serves as the latest example. It's like, the more people you give access to, the more chances there are for compromise, for the system to become compromised. So, maybe they need a certain approval. It would be better if whoever is accessing the information, there's like another set of eyes that need to approve. And I don't know exactly what Coinbase's policies are, but it's just every project that has personal information of someone should be thinking about how they store it and who has access to it and what they can do with the information and how much of it they have. Like, I mean, certainly it would have been better if this was a lot lower of a number of people. Like, getting access to 70,000 users at once, however they did it is not a positive. And it would have been better if they had to do it like one by one. I doubt that this would have been as bad. But secondly, like, I think, maybe the more basic question is, why does Coinbase have that data in the first place? I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning of this topic, like, they're required to, but maybe the philosophical question is, should they be required to? And, I think there's a lot of maybe different viewpoints on KYC and whether it's helpful, or is this doing more harm than good? Because, every other week there's there's billions of dollars worth of data breaches a year, because this is not a crypto problem. This is just because everything is so connected these days and accessible to so many people. It's just a technology problem in general. Like any company has, you have an account with your favorite sandwich maker, and they probably have your name, address, and credit card. Anyone could have a data breach. Medical information has been leaked. There's so much that happens all the time. And maybe if this at least if you get rid of like KYC, then maybe the most sensitive data, like social security number, is a really bad thing to have leaked. And it's just like, yeah, should they be saving that? And should that be like, not, if they do have to collect it, should it be like locked up in a vault somewhere so they never have to access it again? But I do think that there's definitely some important things to consider.
Funny enough, I'm not sure how familiar with like zero knowledge, but like,
yeah, the concept is great, right? I mean, maybe not to get too far off on a tangent, but like, I think that's what like WorldCoin is like trying to do, right? You have a different way of identifying yourself, and then, whoever you're dealing with doesn't need to collect information from you. Like, you're kind of on like some kind of a whitelist, you're a person that can be dealt with. Maybe eventually that will be something that solves the problem. I don't think, like, at least as the laws are today, that somebody, like an institution like Coinbase cannot rely on, another party unless they had like a very specific like agreement from them that they were going to be like the KYC provider or, vendor for Coinbase. I don't think they would be able to just rely on something like that unless they were like had direct, involvement with them. So, but yeah, I mean, that's, we're seeing more and more advancements in the space, and, the ZK avenue could be something in the future where this maybe problem could be resolved in a different way that's acceptable to everybody. But we're a bit away, I think, from that becoming acceptable. We're having enough trouble passing stablecoin legislation, so can only imagine what people will say when we when you try to allow ZK instead of going through the legacy KYC process.
Well, I think that's pretty much covered most of the topics we had for today. It's been a pleasure listening to a lot of your feedback. I've personally learned a lot. Just there's what happens in the news, but then drilling down and understanding the specifics, I think that's where this came into play.
Compared to some years ago, it's remarkable. So we'll see. I'm sure that will continue, and hopefully the developments will be positive. So we'll be watching them and here to discuss anytime.
Exciting times. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you around.